Merry meet! I'm Aislin, and this is Ask Aislin. Happy dark moon, everyone. I'm just going to dive right in. Tonight we're going to be talking about the dark moon, as well as one of my favorite topics, shadow work. So let's start by talking about the phase of the moon that we're in right now. So this is the balsamic moon, and I'd like to talk about two different ways that people look at the balsamic moon. So sometimes it is defined as the 72 hours prior to the new moon. And then sometimes people will define it as really that last quarter of the cycle. So from what we call last quarter, where the moon is half illuminated and half in shadows, all the way up to the dark moon. Now, I prefer to think of it as the first way. I think this is important because in these final 72 hours of the cycle, there is a definite shift in energy. So while the waning moon itself, the entire waning moon, from full to new, is great for releasing of any kind, we see this energy amplified as we get into these last 72 hours. And we'll see this energy most potent right at the dark moon, which is tonight. So let's talk about what does this mean for us, that we're in the balsamic. Not only are we in the balsamic phase right now, but we're in the dark moon. So one thing is we may find ourselves more emotional than usual. So you may find yourself a little weepy, perhaps sentimental, perhaps thinking about the past. This is not uncommon at all. And you might find yourself having difficulty sleeping, but on the other hand, some people find that they sleep a lot during this time. So there's really no right or wrong here. I'm just giving you kind of observations of what people experience during this time. Another thing that may happen is you may notice that your intuition and your awareness is heightened. You may start to see more signs from the universe. Your dreams may become more vibrant. That also can happen at the full moon, but will often happen right here at the balsamic into the dark moon. It's a good time to be working with the third eye and your intuition at this time for that very reason. There is this very slight thinning of the veils that happens as we shift between cycles. It's similar to what we might see at Samhain, just a little bit less pronounced because it happens so rapidly, so quickly, and is opposed to that more stretched out energy that we feel at Samhain. It's also easier to enter the flow state at this time. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the flow state near the end when I get into the Q&A because someone asked a question that this is very relevant to. But the flow state in general is our ability to get into a state where we are in union or in concert with the universe around us. And it's not easy to do. Sometimes it's a gift if we find it, but we're much more likely to find it when we're here in this dark moon part of the cycle. All right, with all that being said, actually a little bit more before I go into shadow work. One of the things about the dark moon is we have this urge. Not only do we have this urge to turn inward, like I mentioned, but we also have kind of this urge to face unpleasant truths. Or we may notice that more unpleasant truths are making their way up to the surface, if we're willing to watch them. So essentially, the body, and I'll be talking about this in a bit, there's more than one layer to your body, but the body, the physical body, as well as the energetic body and the emotional body, they really want to shed. So it's kind of like the snake that sheds its skin. And if you are, if someone who bleeds regularly in a cyclical pattern, like the shedding of the lining of the uterus, there's this, all of us, no matter what gender we are, no matter where we are in our life cycle, we have this urge to shed something if we're willing to. And that is kind of what these unpleasant truths are that swim up to the surface. There are ways that for the unconscious mind to tell us, look, there's something here that you need to release so that you have more room as we enter into the next part of the cycle. Now, the ego might resist this, other parts of us might resist this, but just know that there's always this tendency that is there, or this potential that's there if you want to explore it. Now, before I jump right into the shadow work, I do want to differentiate the dark moon with the new moon. So those who've been following me for a while, you've heard me say it a couple of times, but if you're new here, there's sometimes this confusion, isn't the dark moon and the new moon the same thing? And to some people they are, but to a lot of witches, they are not the same. And in fact, the dark moon is the moment when we go to 0% illumination. So this will happen right before the moon turns new. As soon as the moon shifts into the new moon, or the new part of the cycle, we're going to be at approximately 0.5% to 1% illumination. That's the definition of the new moon. So as soon as you can start to see that little bit, that sliver of light, just a tiny bit, we've already moved into the next cycle. Okay, so tonight, dark moon, we're at 0% illumination. So this is our releasing part, and then tomorrow is the new beginning. All right, so diving into shadow work. So the shadow self is a part of us that has splintered off from what is out in the world, what I sometimes call the light self. This is the self that we share out into the open. And it is natural for us to have a shadow self, and in fact, all of us have one. And if you think you don't, then you're probably fooling yourself, because it is a big part of our work is to acknowledge that we have this. So where does it come from? Well, it's a couple of different ways it develops. One is through roles that we did not accept during our upbringing. So I'll give you one example, and it's kind of a silly one because I don't think it really has much to do with my own shadow self, but who knows. But I have a very, very vibrant memory of this time that I was enrolled in ballet school. And it was disastrous. I had survived like about an hour there, and then I was unenrolled and put into something else. I just didn't really have the balance and the flexibility, which is kind of ironic because now I teach yoga, and so maybe it does have something to do with my shadow self. But that the point being that this idea of this ballerina, this was a role that was not accepted. It was not made part of me as I moved on into my life. So that's where the part of the shadow self can come from, is just simply hats that we tried on that didn't fit for one reason or another, and then they were just kind of left behind as we moved into the rest of our lives. Now, another place that the shadow can develop is through traits that were not accepted by those around us. So this can be the family, the nuclear family, it could be the extended family, it could be the church, religion, whatever religion you were brought up in. It could be friend circles, teachers. So there are certain ways that we might have expressed ourselves when we were young that we were taught very quickly that that is not the way to express yourself. And then those parts, it becomes pretty clear early on that if we want to be accepted in the tribe around us, we're going to need to release some of those traits, right? But when we leave them behind, we don't necessarily just leave them behind. They're still going to be in the unconscious mind. So all of this together starts to form this shadow self. It's essentially what I am not is my shadow. Now, remember, I mentioned this is very normal, and it's important that we acknowledge it, because that's the first step of shadow work, is to acknowledge that we even have this in the first place. Now, in Jung, Carl Jung was a psychoanalyst who studied with Sigmund Freud. I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but he had a breaking away at some point, and he's the one who really coined some of these terms that we use. He believed that through working with the shadow, through working to reintegrate it with the light self, we would find self-realization. And for a lot of us that are on these spiritual paths, that's generally one of the end goals, is we want to find this self-realization. We want to become whole again. And so through shadow working, this is one technique that we can find that self-realization. So You know, this work has to be done one way or the other. So we can do the work here in this incarnation, or we can wait and we can do the work later in another incarnation. And I just offer this for your consideration, but through doing a lot of studying, I've kind of come to understand, you know, whatever work isn't done here, we will do when we cross through the veils, and we'll have to do this before we go into the, you know, the next incarnation. And so in some ways, you might think about that purgatory, that idea that exists in some Christian religions, this idea of purgatory, this place that we stay, it's sort of not hell, but it's not heaven, you know, it's this limbo place, as being that spot where the work that wasn't done in this incarnation gets done. So I don't know about you, but I feel like I would like to do as much as I can here so that when I cross over, I'll have a better crossing over. And, you know, at the end of the day, if we are working towards some type of enlightenment, we got to do this work. Okay, so that being said, how do we do it? So there are a lot of different methods. I won't have time to talk about all of them tonight, but I'm going to talk about some. And then I will get to some of the questions I had that were given to me earlier this week. I'll get to those at the end. So one of the ways that we can work with shadow is to notice what is triggering us. So our triggers will often be our greatest keys that show us the areas that need to be worked on. So we need to, you know, face these realizations about ourselves, and we want to know that the work that we're doing is in the right areas. And so that's why I say these triggers, like the triggers will often be a really good indication that this is an area that you're going to want to work on. So one of the most popular ways to do shadow work, and this is one of the ways that Jung used, was through introspection. We might call it meditation today. Shadow journaling, it has become very, very popular. This is usually any one of these, the meditation, introspection, or shadow journaling will often use some shadow prompts. So here are some examples, and there are hundreds of these that you could use, but here are a few examples. So what qualities irk you about others? And then going a layer deeper, how do you express those qualities, or, you know, not express those qualities? So oftentimes the things that irritate us are the indicators that that's some work that we have to do. So I often tell people, think of a person that you really that really annoys you. It's not like they've done anything bad to you, because then it's obvious why you wouldn't like someone. But it's just somebody that kind of annoys you, or the things they do annoy you. Think about maybe a person that you follow on social media or something that kind of just bothers you. And then think about the qualities in them that bother you. And then peel back another layer and think about how those qualities might be rejected by you. Maybe how do you embody them? So let's say someone is, seems to be very like egotistical, and they're really out there, and maybe that's the part that really bothers you, their ego. So it's usually an indication that your own ego is a spot to work on. So these journaling prompts can be really helpful because they really get the wheels turning. So like here's another idea, like who do you feel jealous of? So oftentimes the qualities that we feel jealous of in others are indications of what we ourselves, you know, areas that we could work on. Another one would be like, the feelings that I'm most afraid to feel. That's another big one. So when we are doing this type of work, you know, if you're just doing the introspection or the meditation, there's not a lot to it. You just try to get into some kind of very relaxed meditative state, and then just let your mind contemplate these ideas. If you're doing the journaling, on the other hand, you can just journal on this topic, stream of consciousness, and just see what comes out. And I'm actually going to talk in a moment about ways that actually some methods that you can do before, if you want to use this method. Like let's say you want to do shadow journaling, some things that you could do prior to it that will put you into a state where you're a little bit more receptive to this kind of work. So I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. So And in fact, I'm going to talk about that. I guess I'll talk about that right now. Why wait, right? So one method is through yin yoga. And yin yoga is a special type of yoga, which is very different than our normal kind of yoga that we think of when we think of the word yoga, that kind of flowing motion. It has nothing to do with that. It's where we go in and we hold poses for longer periods of time. Really, it should be upwards of about 5 minutes. Sometimes 10 minutes can be ideal. And one of the things about yin yoga is that it works to move you through the physical body. So you basically drop down out of the physical body into the energetic body. And underneath that is the emotional body. Now the emotional body is the place where the shadow work has to take place. But it's a little bit hard to tap into it because we're out here living in the physical body. So what the yin yoga does is it drops you down quickly into that space, and you're going to be more receptive to it. So I like, doing these long holds of these poses, and sometimes it'll actually turn into a shadow working session. Now, on one hand, it could just be that you do these practices, like let's say you go and you do some yin yoga, you hold these poses, and it just puts you into a receptive space, and then you do the shadow work. Maybe you move on to the shadow journaling or meditation or something. But other times, I have found that it will drop me right into a shadow working session, and all of a sudden, this stuff is coming up. And one thing you should, be aware of too is that it's okay when you're in that space to really have a lot of strong emotions, and it's very cathartic if we can release. It's not uncommon for people to cry when they get into some of these poses after holding them for 5 minutes, and then some of these emotions and all of this comes up. It's not unusual to cry, and I actually think of this as a gift, because it's a gift that is the way that I can release what's inside of me. So if you have never done yin yoga before, I highly recommend it. And tomorrow, if you're in the group, tomorrow I'm actually going to put up an hour-long practice, a yin yoga practice that you can try if you've never done it before. So that's one thing to think about, using yin yoga as just a means of kind of knocking you into that space where you're ready to do the shadow work. Now, another thing that we can do is work with archetypes. So archetypes are symbols and patterns that exist within the collective unconscious. So the collective unconscious is outside of us. We all have our own unconscious, but the collective unconscious is something that is shared by all of us. And what's interesting about archetypes is they don't really change from culture to culture. So if we look at fairy tales, this is a good place where we can see archetypes and all those roles that are, taken up by characters in the fairy tales. Those are often the archetypes. So there's like a trickster, there's someone who's always trying to trick people. There can be the mother figure, there can be the wise one. So there are actually about 300 different archetypes that exist. There are about 12 to 15 main ones. And what you can do is you can identify some of the archetypes that you yourself embody. And through that, you can then see the shadow side of those archetypes. So it's really powerful work. So I'm going to give a few examples. This in and of itself could be a whole entire segment just talking about archetypes and shadow archetypes. But just to give you a few examples, so one archetype is the ruler. So a person who has some kind of a role as someone in charge would have this archetype, and that could be someone who's a boss in certain places, but it could also be anybody who is kind of the ruler of the house, right, the head of the household. So the ruler in itself is a positive archetype, right? It's a positive thing, but it has a shadow side. So the ruler can turn into the tyrant. It could turn into the bully. So if you feel that you have this archetype of the ruler, you could then explore the shadow side, and then that can give you indications of areas that you could do in your shadow working. So another example would be the mother, and in more of a modern context, we usually call this the caregiver, because it can be any gender at all. And this particular role that many take on can have a shadow side as well. So the mother can turn into the devouring mother or the devouring caregiver, or the withholding mother or withholding caregiver. So you should probably get the idea as I'm going. So here's another one, the sage or the wise one. Now the sage or the wise one is usually the one who has this knowledge to impart on the rest of us, but they can easily, the shadow side can flip into being arrogant and better, elevated, considering yourself elevated over others. Skeptical, closed-minded. So these are all the shadow sides of that sage. The lover can turn into the manipulator or the seducer. So you see where I'm going with this? So if you want to work with archetypes, what I would suggest you do is do a little bit of a research of them, find out which ones exist, see if you can come up with the ones that you feel you embody, and then turn it and look at those shadow aspects of it. The other thing you can do too is you can do more intensive study with this as well. So there's ways to get into archetypal wheels and all these patterns that we have and the archetypes that we house within us. But if you're just starting out, I would suggest just Google it, what are the main archetypes, and see if you can come up with a couple of them that you embody, and then turn that in and look at those the shadow side of those archetypes as well. All right, so after that, this one's a little bit related, but inner child work is a really good way to work with the shadow self, mainly because, as I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of where the shadow self even comes from occurs when we are too young to even know that any of this is going on, right? That's the kind of the unfair thing about it, is that we don't really, but by the time we're even aware of anything, all of this stuff has already been established. So if we can go back and we can work with the inner child, and by the way, everybody has the inner child as one of their archetypes, and there are different forms that it can take. If we can go back and we can work with that inner child, the inner child then becomes this ally that helps us with our shadow work. And so there are a lot of things that we can do to, connect to the inner child. And one thing I like is going on like what I call an inner child date. So if you think about, kind of think back to your childhood and think about things that you really loved that perhaps you don't have any access to today, or you don't allow yourself to have access to today. Or think about things that perhaps you really wanted and couldn't have, like food, certain types of food that take you back to childhood, or toys, or places, or experiences. And go and see if maybe once a month you can take yourself out on one of these inner child dates. So this idea is kind of an extension of the author Julia Cameron, who wrote The Artist's Way. She has a series of books that are all about how we can bring out our creativity, and she has her students take themselves on artist dates. So it's kind of a similar idea, but here we're going to do it as specifically as the inner child. So we really want to befriend the inner child by doing things that the inner child wants to do. And then through that work, the inner child then becomes an ally, and it can open up spaces that we will see for future shadow work. Another really great way to work with the shadow is through ritual. So you can do rituals on the dark moon, and you could do shadow rituals at any time, but the dark moon is especially a good time to do it. So I had actually meant to mention this a little bit earlier, so I'm gonna just mention it here. So there is a powerful ritual that you can do on the dark moon that would actually put you in a really receptive space to then do some shadow work. So whether you are used to doing rituals or not, it doesn't have to be a really big elaborate ritual. If you know how to cast a circle, if you know how to call deities and the elements and all of that, you can do all of that in the beginning. But the most important thing here is the center. So in the center, what you're going to do is do some stream of consciousness writing. So you want to get a piece of paper and write down as much as you can. And I like to do it until I fill the front and the back. And what are all the things that you want to release? So your fear of this, these things that hold you back. For all of us, it's going to be different what we're going to release. And you let yourself really go with this. One thought will lead to the next, will lead to the next. And you pretty much just like you're vomiting all of this up onto the page, all of the stuff that you want to release. We want to put that on the page. And then you can raise energy if you want. You don't have to, but what we want to do is we want to destroy this paper. So what I really like to do is I like to burn it safely and make sure you have something you can put it in when it's burning. Or you can rip it up. That's another really good way, and scatter it to the wind or bury it. But the point is that we want to get rid of it. And then just once it's done, just think about it as being gone. And just accept that that's gone. And you can repeat this practice every dark moon. And in fact, that's what I do almost every dark moon, is I repeat this process. So if we were then going to, we could then from there move into some shadow work. Now, if you really want to do a ritual specifically for shadow work, one thing that I think is really neat is to do the ritual kind of in the like backwards of how you would normally do one. So if you cast a circle clockwise, cast it counterclockwise. If you call the quarters starting with air, call the quarters starting with earth and go around counterclockwise. You can work with darker deities like Inanna or Lilith or Kali. I love working with her. Hecate, Herodwin, Nyx, Ariadne. There's so many that you could work with. So ritual is a really great way to get into the shadow space, and by setting aside this time and making that ritual different than the way that you normally do rituals, it's like it tells your unconscious mind, look, I'm here to do a different kind of work. So I will talk at the end about a few rituals that I have planned, and for those who are interested, I'll kind of give an invitation to those. But for now, I'm going to move on for just a second, and I want to make sure I save space for the questions that I was given. Okay, so the first question I have, I put this one first because it's related to shadow work, and this one comes from Nicole. She said, what do you think is the hardest part of shadow work? Any advice for making it easier? So, you know, it's a big question, so I'm going to try my best to answer it the best way I can. You can always contact me if you want more info. It's the first part about all of it is you have to be able to acknowledge that you have the shadow. So the fact that you're even asking the question means you probably moved through that stage of it. But many people, they really get stuck right in that beginning. They kind of know they want to do this work. They accept that they have it, but then the next thought, well, do I have it? You know, and so the first thing is the acceptance. We just have to kind of move through it into the acceptance of having the shadow, and that's really the beginning spot. Now, the second step is being open and receptive to this kind of work. So, you know, I think probably when you ask what's the hardest part about it, this is probably the hardest thing for people to hear, but it's not fast, it's not quick, it's not easy. And, you know, that can be hard to hear because, you know, we live in a society where we really like instant gratification. We really want practices that we can immediately see that they're working. And shadow work is one that isn't really like that. It takes a lot of time. And in fact, there are some who believe it takes an entire lifetime. So sometimes I'll see people say like, oh, I've already done all my shadow work. And well, it could be true, honestly, to have all your shadow work done by like age 30, 40, even 50 or 60, there's probably more to do. So really that can be one of the hardest things, is just to accept that this is going to be a lifelong process. And it doesn't mean that it always has to be really hard. It can be a little bit harder in the beginning, but through working with it, like I like to work with it cyclically, you know, and kind of really making a conscious effort that I'm going to be working on this every cycle, or maybe every other cycle, or every couple of cycles. Give yourself a break in between if you want to, but just knowing that it's going to be this kind of long process. So then the third thing I think that's difficult about it is knowing what to do, because if you go out and you Google this, you're going to find all these different answers from different people, and the question is like, how do you put it all together? How do you know really what to do? Because that info is all over the place. So it's okay to pick up bits and pieces from here and there, and, you know, except there's some that you will resonate with, and those are the ones that I would put into practice, and there's others that you're not going to resonate with. In fact, there'll be things that I say that just don't resonate with you. And that's going to be one of the parts too, because at the end of the day, it's your own shadow work. So you want to find the parts that make the most sense for your own journey. No matter what you do, though, you've got to have some kind of a system. So if you are going to pick up bits and pieces from here and there, you want to make sure you put them into some kind of a system. But by this, what I mean is that you set that time aside every month or every other month. When it gets to be the dark moon, I know that I'm going to go in and I'm going to do something from that, maybe that little catalog of things that I've collected. But for many people, what they'll do is they'll kind of get into that space, and they have a good start. They have a lot of initiative they want to take, but then they sort of lose their traction, and they just the wheels are spinning, don't really know what to do. And that's where finding a guide, a mentor, a teacher, someone who has been through it can be really helpful. And you can work privately with people, or you can work as a group. And here I'm just going to mention that I do have a membership that's going to be starting next month, and the first few months of it we are going to dive in and do a bunch of shadow work together. So that's always an option, and if anybody watching this is interested in that, I'll talk a little bit more about it right at the end and give you a little bit more detail. But it is definitely an option, is to find a space where either someone is going to kind of lead you through it individually, or you're going to kind of work on it with a group. So the other thing I always want to mention, especially because the question is what's the hardest part here, is that shadow work can drag up a bunch of stuff that is not comfortable. And so I really think it's a good idea to have a therapist in place, or someone who's trained in mental health, in some way, or at least have a good friend that you can go to and you can talk to. Or like the group that I'm starting, the membership, where there's going to be people doing it together. So it's always really good to just at least have somebody that you can check in with. And if you feel that you're getting really overwhelmed with the work, really don't be afraid to reach out to a therapist, a mental health counselor, some kind of a specialist. Because like I said, it's going to drag up a lot of stuff. And some of this stuff that you're going to see is is very unpleasant, and not stuff that you are used to facing. And I guess that would be my best advice. So I hope that kind of answered the question, but if you have more that you want to talk about, definitely message me and let me know. Okay, so then I got one more question here. This one comes from Dawn. So Dawn says, I'm trying to learn how to hear my guides. What are ways I can hear them, and what kinds of things do I ask them as a sign? So this one, like the other question, it's kind of a tough question, but I have a lot of feedback I want to give you, so I hope that some of this helps. There, like the question about the shadow work, there really isn't an easy answer here. So one of the things to think about is, what do we mean when we're talking about guides? Are we referring to, sometimes people refer to archangels, to, guiding spirits, spirit animals, ascended masters. So these were people who kind of elevated here. They moved through all this work we're talking about, and then when they cross over, instead of reincarnating back into this plane, they have chosen to be an ascended master and help others that are here. Departed loved ones can be guides, if you think about this as like the universe is all one, it really could be considered all the same thing. And these different facets of how we look at it, these are just ways to make it make sense in our own mind. But sometimes when we're talking about guides, we're actually talking about our own higher self, which has way more knowledge than we ever give it credit for. So one thing that we want to consider with guides is this idea of synchronicity. So synchronicity is a coin that was termed by Carl Jung. He said this meant meaningful coincidence. So he didn't actually say that there were no coincidences, but there were these meaningful coincidences that are essentially like symbols or signs that we see out in the universe. And the thing is that the language of the unconscious mind, which is where we actually have to tap into in order to contact the guides, is the language here is symbolic. So that's why you'll hear people talk about like numbers or colors or different things that they saw. It's because the guides won't always talk in complete sentences. Sometimes it'll come through as these symbols or these signs that we have to interpret, and that can be kind of hard. But let me give you like a few examples of like the synchronicity in play. So for example, when I was living in Boston quite some time ago, I really had this revelation at one point that I needed to move to Los Angeles. And as soon as that revelation came, all of a sudden, everywhere I looked, there seemed to be messages about the West Coast, LA, songs that were playing on the radio, TV shows, different things like that. And so it was almost like the universe, once we decide that we're going to follow a certain path, it's like the universe conspires to work with us to achieve that. So another example would be a couple of weeks ago, I was feeling kind of lonely and didn't really feel like, I've been pretty isolated since COVID began. I do have asthma, so I'm careful about where I go. And I was feeling lonely. And then all of a sudden, like right in a row, all these people kind of reached out to me. So to me, that was like synchronous, right? So I kind of put out this energy and then this thing was returned to me. And in fact, on Saturday, I was hiking up in the mountains and I was coming down. And as I was coming down, I don't know how it did it, but my phone dialed one of my friends. He was actually in Vienna at the time. But we both, he wrote to me and he's like, did you call me? I was like, no, I was coming out of the mountains. He said, well, I was thinking of you at that exact second. And then all of a sudden, the phone rang and it was 6 a.m. in Vienna. And I said, well, I think it's a divine sign that it's time for us to, schedule a time to talk. So those kinds of signs, those synchronicities that come from the universe. Another example would be like a person who has a fight with their husband, and then the next day on a coworker's desk they see a book about how to communicate better with your partner. So all these little signs, right? Numbers, animals that we see, songs on the radio, and one of the things that I think that we run into is that we get a little bit afraid that is it truly a sign, or am I making this up? Am I crazy? And as my acupuncturist says, he says, what's crazier to believe? That like all these things that seem to be in front of you are truly signs from the universe, or that all of this, or is it crazier to believe that like we, none of this matters? Like, so it's up to you and your mind to make it make sense for you. But I think that this would be my absolute best advice for someone who's wanting to, connect more to that, that divine power out there, the higher self, the guides, everything, is to decide to go all in. So I've had this own, issue with myself. It's not always been easy to trust the signs from the universe. And I had this person, it was an intuitive person that I had met with, and she said, you're standing there and you've got 1 foot in and you've got 1 foot out. And the question is like, are you, which you got to choose a side. So if you really want to work with your, intuition, if you want to connect to your higher self, to the guides out there, you have to decide to go all in. It doesn't mean it has to be perfect, but you at least have to kind of make an effort. Like, I'm going to go in, even for a little bit of time, even for 6 months, I'm just going to not second guess myself, right? I'm going to be watching for the signs out there. And, part of the problem is that in the collective unconscious of the world, I talked about it a little bit before, there's good things in the collective unconscious, but there's also some bad stuff there. And the collective that we're living in right now is a collective that most people don't believe in magic, they don't believe in signs, they don't believe in the guides. and there's just a lot of negativity and doubt, and that wears on us. And because remember, everybody connects to that collective unconscious. And the other problem can also be, unless you grew up in a space where you had a caregiver who was really able to help you strengthen your gifts, acknowledge what they were. Most of us didn't have that. So we might have had these gifts as we were growing up, and then they were stifled by the people around us. So there's a lot of self-doubt here and a lot of fear that we got to get down underneath if we're going to work with this stuff and connect to the guides and in the universe and everything that's out there. So I say go gentle on yourself, but the first step is decide you're going to go all in. Like, I'm going to do this. I'm really going to make an effort, and I'm going to listen to what's out there around me, even if it's just a short time, right? And then once you make that decision, then you really need something that's going to get rid of that self-doubt and strengthen the intuitive powers. So you need some kind of an energetic system that you're going to work with. I really prefer the chakra system. So working with the solar plexus is really good at eliminating self-doubt. Working with the third eye is really good at expanding and opening us up to like the higher consciousness and all that's around us. And, from there, figuring out, how to get into that flow state. So when we move into the flow state, I talked about a little bit at the beginning, that's where we start to really open up to everything that's around us. Now, it's not easy to get there, but you can do it through things that are repetitive, like sweeping the floor or walking or hiking. Any kind of movement that's repetitive has the potential to drop us into the flow state. And, from there, thinking about developing a regular spiritual practice, whatever that means, whether it's working with the energy centers. So like I mentioned, the solar plexus and the third eye are just two of the many energy centers, but working with those or working with some kind of a spiritual practice where it doesn't have to be every day, but I would say more times than not a week, sitting down, even if it's for 10 minutes, and doing something that's going to kind of open you up here. So working with the chakras could be one, doing breath work, meditation, yoga, all of these things can work to really align you and make you more receptive to the messages that are coming through. So I hope that helped. If you still need, more guidance, definitely reach out to me, let me know. And I'm just checking to see if there's any more questions here. So I did want to just mention again that I do have this membership that's opening up next month. I have a very limited number of spaces for it right now. And so if you're interested in this, we're going to be starting by doing some shadow work. We are going to dive in. There's some really interesting rituals we'll be doing. We're going to be working with Chiron, which is the wounded healer. We'll actually be looking at our astrological charts to find in them where we have this one space that shows us our own wound, which is when we heal that, we become the healer to others. It makes us better healers. So that's a really cool ritual. We're going to be doing a ritual with a Nana, descending down into the underworld to get into the shadow work. And I think we're going to be working with Ariadne. That was another thing I forgot to mention, is that I have been having some signs, a lot of spiders I've been coming across, and kind of some connections from Ariadne, so she can be a really cool one to work with during ritual. So that is the membership, and it's going to be coming next month. So if you're interested, just definitely let me know. And also on August 8th is the Lionsgate portal. I'll be mentioning more about this in the days leading up to this. We also have Lunaza coming next week. That is the first of the 3 harvest festivals of the Wheel of the Year. This is a time of really good time for bringing in abundance, whatever you call abundance, whatever it is you want more of in your life. It's a really good time to be open to that right now. So I'm going to be putting on a Lunaza Lionsgate portal ritual on the 8th, which is the day of the most heightened energy for this. So you can look for that soon. I'll be putting out an invitation for that, so I hope you can attend. And also my Money Magic course, because of this alignment, I'm going to be offering a discount for that as well. All right, so if I don't have any more questions, I'm going to sign off for tonight. I'm actually going to get prepared for my own dark moon practice tonight. So I hope that you have enjoyed tonight's show segment. And if there's anything more that you would like to learn about, definitely reach out to me. If there's a question you have, you can always let me know, and I'll include it in next week's episode. All right, until then, blessed be.